Boardroom Bound, Episode 101, Assessing Risk in a Boardroom and What to Avoid, with Martha Cummings.
And that was part of the thought process behind bringing someone like me in. It's that they wanted to try to avoid some of the mistakes that had been made leading up to the financial crisis by having a proactive dialogue with the board and senior management that complemented the exam-based supervision.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Martha Cummings. And she is, when you think about from my perspective, being someone from Wall Street, the finance background, she has been there and done it all. From being a chief risk officer to being a supervisory agent for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. She has been there, she has done it. And this is going to be a great example of someone having a deep sector expertise and how that builds a platform for authority and how that will directly land her into board seats going forward. And you'll hear about not only her journey to get these experiences, but how she's thinking about using that as she goes forward towards finding a portfolio of board opportunities. Let's jump into the show. Martha Cummings, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you, Alexander. I'm very excited to be here.
Well, for me, this is a fun episode because it's worlds colliding, right? So you and I went to the best business school in the world. We're biased, but that's Wharton very clearly. And we are on an external group outside of this because we're both governance geeks. We love board stuff, where within Wharton, we are in a small group of people focused on being better prepared for the boards and networking for the boards. So it's great fun to have you on our show today. And your bio and experience is unique. It stands out. It's fabulous. And it's only a matter of time where you're on many of the leading boards that names that would roll off the tip of our tongue. So there's so much for us to uncover today based on your background experience and talking about what you're going through and what you're thinking about and how you're doing it. It's going to be eye-opening, I think, for a lot of our audience and what they should be doing in best practices. But before I get there, you have this fabulous career, but let's unpack that a little bit for our audience to understand the position you're in today and how you got there.
Okay, great. Thanks. It has been a great journey. I grew up in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, and my undergraduate was at University of Minnesota. I majored in economics and a minor in Spanish, and have always been very drawn to international business. And when I was applying for business schools, my first choice was the Lauder Institute at Wharton. Lauder Institute combining both the Masters of Arts in International Studies and the Wharton MBA. And it's definitely a slacker program. You do the 2 degrees in 2 years. And I was just super thrilled about it. But I thought, well, if I don't get into that program, because only 50 at the time were admitted each year, my second choice was just Wharton itself, because it was, even without the Lauder Institute, a very internationally oriented program, as well as obviously being, as you said, the greatest business school in the world, and we're not biased at all. And I was accepted to the Lauder Institute. I did my concentration in Latin America. I already spoke Spanish when I arrived, and I was then able to take on learning Portuguese, which was great fun. I spent a summer in Brazil, and then my internship between the 2 years was a city in Mexico. And when I came out of business school and Lauder, I had the choice of going to international staff with Citi, which was a really premier program at the time, very exciting, but very different in that you would go to one particular country and essentially be immersed in that country. And I ended up going to Bankers Trust and working in Latin America investment banking, because it enabled me to be involved in various different countries. And it was a lot of fun. In fact, I'm still in touch with people from that time period today, because it was such a formative time in what we all ended up becoming, and did some really groundbreaking transactions for both public and private sector clients within Latin America. And then moved on to Santander and flipped over to the risk management side of the world. Partially a personal decision. I was pregnant with our second child at the time, and I had been traveling about 75% of my time. And it was just really a way to calm down the travel a little bit, but also intellectually interesting because I flipped the perspective from being a business person who was out doing client development and solving clients' problems and doing transactions in the markets to looking at the transactions from both the bank's perspective and the balance sheet and the reputational risk, as well as the client's perspective. Was it the best suited transaction? Was there a different way to structure it that would make more sense? Things along those lines. And so I dealt with everything from local debentures in the Brazilian capital markets to internationally syndicated loans to equity offerings, and to workouts of bad loans, because sometimes they don't all go well. And I think many of us would agree that we've learned more over the course of our career by the things that didn't go as well as we did from the things that went well. And workouts were definitely one of those places. And I eventually became chief risk officer for the New York operations of Santander, their securities business on the New York branch. And that was also very fun, very interesting. But I got to the point where I was really missing clients because I didn't see the clients unless, frankly, they owed us really quite a bit of money and weren't doing so well. Otherwise, other people that worked for me got to see them. So I moved back into a client-facing role, and I covered the financial sponsors, and it was in many ways a niche business for Santander. We weren't big into the highly leveraged finance, but if you needed somebody to help you do project finance in the electrical sector in Chile, for example, we were your bank. And so I met some very interesting clients and had some fun with that role. And then I was recruited to go to the Federal Reserve because they were looking for somebody who was senior in banking, understood both the business and the risk management aspects of it, and would come in to supervise one of the large global institutions and really be able
real
to
quick,
augment.
Martha, this is after a big financial crisis. There was a need for a lot of firepower there.
Exactly, and that was part of the thought process behind bringing someone like me in. It's that they wanted to try to avoid some of the mistakes that had been made leading up to the financial crisis by having a proactive dialogue with the board and senior management that complemented the exam-based supervision. So I took on that role, which is really great. I learned so much in that capacity and really saw banks from the perspective of the board and the CEO, and spent a lot of my time with boards and the C-suite of the banks that I supervised, and then was also involved in system-wide activities of the Federal Reserve on governance, on conduct and ethics and culture. I represented the bank in Basel on the Basel Committee for Supervision subcommittee on supervisory implementation, so was exposed to how, A, that kind of a governing body works, but also, B, the challenges of implementing global supervision with all the different international jurisdictions. And then was thinking about my next step, had become very interested in boards and I was fascinated by the differences among the boards that I encountered in my supervisory work, the culture being different among them, the way that they structured themselves, the governance, and even how that could change if there were a change in the chairman or if the institution encountered a crisis of some sort. And so I was looking to really move to a portfolio career and pursue board work as well as some advisory and not-for-profit. And I was approached for several board roles. I didn't find the right fit. I turned down some because they just didn't feel like the right thing. I didn't think the governance was right. It just didn't excite me. Various different kinds of reasons. And was in conversations with some others when I was approached for and took on a transformation role at Wells Fargo to establish and build out an enterprise compliance risk management function, which was interesting to me because I had primarily focused on market and credit risk in my career and then a lot on reputational risk and conduct when I was at the Federal Reserve, but hadn't gone deep into compliance. And it was somewhat similar motivation to what drew me to the Fed, which was if I could in some way help to keep taxpayer money from being at risk again as it was in the crisis, I wanted to do that. And in the case of Wells Fargo, as I think probably all of the listeners have read, there were some significant challenges there, and I really was drawn to trying to help an important institution. And it also gave me the opportunity to go deeper into a risk discipline that I hadn't been as deeply involved with. And so I went in and built out a great team and did a lot of remediation. So really felt like I could go back to pursuing the path I had been on, which is a portfolio career of boards, private equity and fintech advisory, and not-for-profit. And where I am at this point. And again, have been approached on some things that have not found the right fit at this point. I am on an advisory board for something that, as I mentioned earlier, I'm quite passionate about. It's the School of Language, Culture, and World Affairs at the College of Charleston, which appeals to my love of language and international interaction, and also allows me to give back to the community because my home is actually in Charleston, South Carolina. So it's a fun, some fun times embarking on a different way of looking at one's career and how to use the experience and expertise that I've developed over the years.
And so when I summarize this, if I'm a listener, so clearly you have an expertise within financial services, with risk, with the strategy. In addition to that, thinking about your calling card, you have worked a tremendous amount of time with the C-suite and with the board. So we talk about how do you share who you are in a way that's valuable to the person on the other side hiring you. You may not have had many board roles yet, but you've been working with the board for a long time. That is invaluable. You bring an expertise from a different mindset. And I would love if we could unpack that a little bit. Now, I remember being on the other side of the fence. I joined J.P. Morgan after Wharton in order to try and solve some of the problems that they had. And we were in the top fold of the newspaper for a long time as the whipping boy for all the problems that we had developed that we were working to solve for them. And so you're a regulatory supervisor. You're getting a lot of face time, getting a lot of attention from these boards. And I'm sure from that, you saw some best practice or maybe the opposite of that in some cases. And I'd love if we could unpick some of that, because you've just said something here that you've been approached by some opportunities, but you've chosen to pass on them. That due diligence is essential. And people should probably always memorize, don't take the first board you're offered, take the right board, because then you'll do well and things will continue to progress and have opportunities for you. So Martha, I'd love if we could unpick some of the lessons that you've learned when you were working with the boards. Maybe we just talk about some of the, say, beginning simple things like roles and responsibilities of board versus management. That can be blurry. You talked about different organizations have different structures. How would you think about the do's and don'ts there?
That's a great question, and I think it's something that a lot of boards tend to struggle with, and I think that's actually not a bad thing, because there should be some fluidity to it depending upon the type of board, the type of company, and the circumstances that the company is in. But as a general matter, boards should provide oversight. They represent the shareholders, and they need to also bring in consideration of broader stakeholder groups, including employees, customers, vendors, society at large, into the discussion about strategy and about how the company is taking on its business and executing on its business. The board should be active in strategy. It should approve, especially if it's a financial institution board, the risk appetite, the capital plan, big parts of how the business is done from a big picture perspective should definitely go to the board. The board should challenge management, and frankly, it should also challenge itself. It should hire the CEO and should generally be involved in other key hires, but it should influence and mentor management. It should not be management. And sometimes I've seen that can be difficult, especially for some new directors who have been stellar executives and done fantastic things in their career, to be able to make that transition, that they are not the ones rolling up their sleeves and actually getting things done, and that there has to be a line between what the board does and what management does. So management should develop a strategy, interact with the board on the strategy, and other key elements, as I mentioned earlier, such as risk appetite, capital plan, compensation structure, et cetera. They should be the ones who execute the strategy. They run the business day to day. They are the ones who actually have to get it done. And it's been described to me in different ways, which I think are quite appropriate. Someone who is a chair and on several boards as a director, independent director, that the difference is like it's from being a parent to being a grandparent. Huh. You're a board member, you're not management, and that I think is actually kind of a good way to describe it. You don't get to do, but you have to influence and guide.
I like nose in, fingers out, but yours makes more sense to me now that I'm a parent of two kids. And you think about you're the hands-on versus you're the wise counsel who's been there and done that, and they can come seek advice from you. But I also think the grandparent is the one you're able to give them sugar and money and send them home when there's a problem. What the board shouldn't really do it quite that way. But I like your analogy there.
That was it. I was going to caveat that, but you don't get to fill them with sugar and then just hand them back. You do actually have to live with them, and that's part of the question that you raised earlier about, how does one decide what to do in terms of accepting a board role? It's a really long-term, important commitment. And, another analogy that I think makes sense is it's somewhat like a marriage. It's not for a short period of time, and you're probably going to encounter some difficulties along the way. So you need to think about how you're going to feel about the rest of the board members and the management team, acknowledging that there may be turnover and there may not be all the same players as when you start, but to the best of your capabilities and knowledge at the time, do you feel like that is a good match and one where you can both add value and continue to learn as you go along and execute your responsibilities?
Well, that's a really interesting topic. So maybe we should think about it in terms of challenge versus collegiality among the board. How would you think about that?
It's a very delicate and important balance. And I think it's even more challenging right now because everything is being done on a remote basis. And like many things in business, I think we as human beings are pretty capable of maintaining relationships that we've built for some period of time anyway at a pretty good level using the technology, particularly because the technology has advanced quite a bit. But the dynamics are very different from when normally you would have in-person board meetings, and there would be a board dinner, and there would be sidebar conversations, and both with the board among the different directors, as well as the interactions with management. The personal interaction improves the communication, and it improves the ability to, I think, both have positive conversations, but also negative conversations. Because there's some rapport that's built up, it isn't necessarily as personal if there's challenge and criticism by the board of management, or even challenge of the board within itself, as it might be if it's done all via video and there hasn't been that kind of base of trust and knowing each other a bit and having a conversation that isn't necessarily just strictly to an agenda or to a topic. So I'm hopeful that we will get through the pandemic and be able to get back to at least some mix of in-person and not in-person board meetings. I also think there's a risk of management being able to not necessarily be as forthcoming as they might be, or to be as challenged as boards might to be able to do in an in-person meeting as it is with Zoom. But going back to your question about challenge and collegiality, it's critical that you get that balance. And again, this is a potential pitfall of a new director, that they see so many areas of opportunity for improvement, problems, however you want to describe it, and they speak up so much and they question so much that the conversation is monopolized, the agenda is taken off track. It's difficult to keep time on what the topics need to be and to get through everything that needs to get through. And so it's finding that balance between picking when it's very important to challenge and question and bring something up that might not have been thought of, and just sort of saying everything that comes into your head that might be of interest or might be able to improve things. You don't want to be a detractor, but you also don't want to just be a rubber stamper. And I think that's a level of maturity that executives build throughout their career, but sometimes it takes some time in a boardroom setting to find that right balance, that you do need to be thoughtful and you do need to express dissenting views, but there also has to be a sense of we are a team and we are together going to bring this organization into a better place and continue to put it forth in a positive sense in the future.
Well, you talked about a couple things that are really interesting. So if we think about the boardroom environment and you are surrounded by whatever the number is, 12 other brilliant people, let's say you're at a Fortune 50 company, all fabulously successful executives who got there, just like you said, by doing work, have to operate in a different way in the boardroom. And as a new board member, you have to realize you're not the only person who's got really good insights to share. And to your point, not monopolizing conversation. I liken it to a sort of a pre-COVID baseball game where you got on a typical, maybe you got up 4 times to bat. You probably get about that many questions on a typical board day so that everybody else has their time to share. And it's finding when you can add value and how to do it. And you also mentioned if we're back in sort of the Zoom space versus back in the face-to-face. I have a friend who's a Fortune 50 board member, and he explained that his board has changed. There's a philosophy now of they still know they need to get together once, probably twice a year in person, have the dinner to know each other well. And they'll still do a monthly check-in call now for an hour to make sure they're on top of things and cover things off. And they'll do the other 2 quarterly board meetings like full day on Zoom. But they realize they may not need to be there as much as they used to in the old days, which was hard to get everybody together and the travel was expensive. The world has changed, but you need that collegiality. You need that relationship with other people. Where you worked at Wells Fargo recently, could you imagine how complex those board discussions were when they were going through the hardships that they were going through? And if you'd only ever been on Zoom, it would be so much harder to read the room and know how to share and have the insights. But you've had opportunities with boards that are going through those really tough times. What is the best practice that you picked up that you think I'm going to bring with me when I'm on different boards about how to work through the toughest situations that might arise?
There are a lot of different tactics and strategies for addressing adverse situations that I've seen, and I've seen them to be different across boards and have different levels of effectiveness. And some of that depends upon the structure, some of it depends upon the individuals. I would say that the first need is to have the ability to be agile and to react to when, for example, a committee structure needs to be altered. Right now we're seeing a trend, as many trends have been accelerated through COVID and through the social unrest and economic dislocation that has come about over the past several months. Many things that were already a trend have just become much more of an imperative. And one of the areas that, in my opinion, is an example of something that was previously a nice to have and now is an imperative is a greater attention on ESG, so environmental, social, and governance. And how a board addresses that, I've seen it done in different ways. I've seen separate committees for it. I've seen it addressed through the risk committee. I've seen it addressed through the strategy session. And I think there's no one right answer, but what boards need to be able to do is to say, okay, what do we need to do on a day-to-day oversight and governance perspective? What is it that has changed that we have to react to? And are we properly structured and staffed to be able to do that? Do we need a different type of expertise on the board that we may not have right now? And how do we translate what may just be seen as negatives into positives, and how do we challenge management to do that? I mean, everybody knows that with every crisis comes opportunities, but boards are bombarded right now. I mean, they're trying to get through this crisis. They're trying to see where there might be opportunities and then also anticipate the next one. And in my view, it's the board's responsibility to help management to take that step back and say, how are we as a company structured to address this? And it starts with the board. Do we have the right people and the right structure to be able to address the current challenges as well as to be forward-looking? And are we challenging and mentoring management sufficiently so that they are looking at that as opposed to a mindset of, well, we just have to get through this and then everything will be back to normal. So it's that ability to be somewhat forward-looking at the same time that you are acting as a steward of the organization that, to me, really differentiates a high-performing board from a board that's just okay.
That's a real interesting point. So we are in a crisis, and it's inevitable that there will be future crises, whether it's for an individual company or an industry or hopefully not the world again. But I liken that to, I'm not driving on the highway looking through my rear view window. I want to be looking through the windshield and to be positioning ahead, which can be hard to do when you're head down trying to solve where you are today, maybe stay solvent and continue the business. But that is the job of the board, especially to help management to think about that. And you lived through that with some of the companies that you were supervising. They were struggling and there were questions about how they were going to do it. And when you go forward onto the next organizations that you will join as a board, you will bring that as part of your skill set. And I think this ties into a broader sort of board composition discussion, if we think about it that way, of finding not only the right culture fit for the people who bring on board, the right skill sets to add, but also as the world has been changing. I would argue, say, like CHROs, the chief HR officers, becoming more and more valuable during this crisis of how do you find the talent, retain the talent, take it forward. We are seeing boards changing and what the skill sets are that they're looking at and how they prioritize them. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, it's definitely something, again, that I think has been accelerated given what we've been living through. And, board composition, we all know that it used to look very similar when you went board to board. And it was an old boys club in many respects, and it was not necessarily a board composition that was reflecting the customer base of the company or the broader base of potential customers in society, or even really a well thought out, these are the challenges that we have in this company. Do we have the right expertise to address those challenges? I think it has become much more apparent and accepted and actually sought after that boards have to have diversity in terms of gender, age, race, and work experience. And in talking with some others who are interested in joining boards, I heard a couple say, a problem I have is that I'm seen as being too young. And I said, no, you need to just not be thinking that is a detriment. That's actually a positive, because you probably are one of the few people who is board ready and qualified, but also can bring a different generational and age bracket perspective to the board. And that's something that's needed. Just the same as, you need financial expertise, and you need risk expertise, and you need technology expertise. You need to have diversity of perspectives and what kind of experience people bring to a board, because that just generates a much richer board that can better reflect who it is that they're trying to serve as their constituents. The flip side of that is I do get somewhat concerned, because sometimes there's a real check-the-box approach that whether it's due to pressure from shareholder services and investor organizations, or whether it's the board itself or some combination thereof, in thinking, okay, we need a financial expert. I think everybody agrees, yes, you have to have that, because you start with knowing whether or not the books are correct. That's just sort of a given. You have to have that. You need people with risk management expertise, because risk is going to be a constant, and if you're a financial institution, it's not just something that you have to manage, but it's your product. You have to price it. You have to analyze it. And you need to have some level of technology expertise, but that's a very broad requirement to try to bring in. And so it needs delving further into to say, well, what do we really need to have in terms of that kind of perspective? And is it, one person? Is it two people? Is it part of what somebody brings? How do we kind of get that expertise? But sometimes I fear that there isn't enough focus put on getting simply wise people who have the ability to challenge and influence and mentor and can bring experience to bear in a way that might not fit into one of those boxes. And if every company just ends up with the same recipe and the boxes checked, we're not going to have very creative or fruitful discussions, and probably not as much challenge as people think that they might get, because they might not have chosen people for those aspects in addition to needing to check the box on a particular kind of technical expertise.
That's really interesting, and I like the way you've talked about it from, say, the organization's perspective of finding the people to put on their board, but I'd also like to think it from the individual perspective, both, say, you looking for the boards you want to join or any of our audience, and I would liken it to, and this may not be the right ratio, but 50-50. You should be able to add incredible value in your area of expertise, your industry, whatever it is, but there's also got to be opportunities for you to learn and grow while you're there, because that's where it's really exciting and it's interesting. How do you think about balancing this? A way that you can really contribute, but also that you can see yourself grow in that role?
I think there are a couple of ways. I think you look at it from a particular board, and then the composition of the portfolio of boards and other activities that an individual might be engaged in. I totally agree with you that it's both from the individual's perspective and from the company's perspective that you need to have it be a good match between the expertise that they're bringing and their ability to learn and continue to grow. Because if someone doesn't feel that they have the ability to learn and continue to grow, their engagement is not going to be as high as it will be if they feel that they're part of building something and both contributing and getting from it. They're going to be much more engaged. They're going to put much more time into it. They're going to put much more of themselves into it. And you want an engaged board member. So I think that's a win-win from both sides of it. But it also comes into play when thinking about the different types of boards and different activities that somebody might want to have as part of their portfolio. So in my case, for example, I'm in conversations with the private equity firm because I think it'd be interesting to have that kind of a board in addition to a larger public board because they're very different. And in fact, in a private equity board, and we just talked about some of the lines between management and directors, that line may be very different in a private equity-owned board. Much more active in many cases on the advisory side. Many cases it's much more expected that a director will help in terms of clients and connections and business development than it might be on a public board. And by the same token, that greater hands-on and in many respects quite likely a smaller organization, probably in a different type of industry, brings a level of diverse way of approaching problems and thinking about the world to the other boards. And so it's obviously important that you manage conflicts, both real and potential. And then something else that I think people often don't think about, which is, could there be a perceived conflict of interest, even if it doesn't actually materialize, and what are the implications of that? So you have to manage the conflict, but constructing a good, diversified portfolio helps out all of the different organizations because you're able to bring to bear much more for each of these different elements.
Well, Martha, it's fabulous to look back at your career and see how it has grown and developed, perhaps in ways you didn't anticipate originally, but we can see how they come together as a story now and understand your calling card, your area of expertise. Very clear how that would add value to boards, and it's fun hearing how you are wrestling yourself with the various parts of, okay, how am I going to add value? How do I figure out the ones that are a right fit for me? Which is clearly something everyone in our audience should be doing as they begin to position themselves for the right opportunities they want to seek. And we were delighted to have you on the show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. I've always enjoyed your podcast. It was great to be part of one.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Martha Cummings. It's kind of fun for me thinking about how she was on the regulatory side when I was sitting on the other side working at JP Morgan, but in the same way how I can similarly think about, okay, this is how you build your platform, you take these experiences, you take it forward, and that works for all of us, whether you're in the financial services industry or somewhere else. Martha's done a wonderful job spinning a very simple story about how it all comes together, and that's what we need to do to position ourselves to be successful in the boardroom and get those opportunities. Now, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will find links to everything that we talked about today. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.